Hi, everyone. So welcome. This talk is about diversity in practice, how the Boston Python user group grew to actually over 1,800 members as of PyCon, and over 15% women. The thesis for this talk is that diversity makes a user group better. It makes it better for everyone. So when you have a diverse user group, it is more dynamic. You can run more event styles, catering to more backgrounds. You learn more from other members, and you can teach more members. So diversity is good for everyone in a user group. That's the thesis of this talk. And then additionally, diversity outreach by a user group is a great tool for helping you grow, for reaching into and introducing yourself to new communities to bolster your membership. We'd like to talk about one such diversity outreach experiment that we've been running for the past year in Boston. It's called the Boston Python Workshop, and it's an intro to Python event focusing on women. And this has had a pretty transformative effect on the user group, and I'd like to share some of what we've learned, our successes, and hopefully by the end of this talk, motivate you to go back to your communities after PyCon and think about diversity outreach in your cities. So briefly who we are, my name is Jessica, this is Asheesh. We're both Boston Python user group organizers. We're also Python Software Foundation members, and in particular, we're on the PSF Outreach and Education Committee. We are significantly maintainers for the Open Hatch project, which is a project dedicated to lowering the barrier to entry to open source contribution. It's a nonprofit. So that's who we are. And this is the workshop. So why run a diversity outreach event focusing on women? I'd like to talk a bit about our motivations, sort of what we've actually achieved, history so far. Our motivations are based on some pretty simple observations in Boston. You know, a year ago, we knew just by going and attending events, there were basically no women attending these events. And we run these events through meetup.com, so we have historical data on this, and we know back through 2007 that basically 0 to 2% women at any given event. So not really any women. A little bit sad. And then also, there's not really a pipeline for beginning programmers or newcomers to Python. We're all volunteers in Boston, and it can be easy to fall into focusing on people who already know how to program, people who are professional programmers, because it can take work to think about running intro events focusing on beginners. So there wasn't a great pipeline for beginners in this user group. And then the overriding thing that we wanted to think about was, okay, let's get more women into this user group, but let's focus on change from within. So instead of going out and creating a new community, you know, a Boston Python for Women group, or running sort of sporadic individual events, try changing the user group from within. Let's do some outreach, diversity outreach, as a part of the user group and see what it really takes to really change sort of the basic community in Boston. So that's what we wanted to do. We have a couple of basic goals. Okay, number one, just straight up get more women into the community. And to be concrete about this, okay, go from 0% women to 15% women. Our goal is 15% women at sort of arbitrary user group events. Number two, use these workshops as a platform to sort of showcase the great women programmers that we know exist in the Boston Python community. As teachers, as leaders, do some stereotype busting about this notion that there aren't any women programmers. And then three, use Boston as a sort of a staging ground, a playground for working on these outreach events as an example that other user groups could maybe follow. So here's what we've done so far. We've been running these Intro to Python workshops focusing on women for the past year. We've run 5 workshops and follow-up events. Over 200 women have gone through these events to sort of become a part of the user group. We've cultivated an awesome, huge volunteer base, a couple of dozen volunteers, mostly women from the local programming and open source communities. And we think that we've done a pretty good job of establishing a beginner's pipeline, starting with these workshops. So we have these Boston Python workshops focusing on women and their friends, and then we have these unstructured project nights. You might call them a hack night that we always run as a follow-up. It's a second touch point for our workshop alums, and it's a good opportunity to keep learning and practicing Python in an unstructured way. And at that point, you're well positioned to just be a general user group member. So that's what we've done so far.
Thanks, Jessica, for introducing the goals of the event. I want to take a few minutes and explain exactly how the Boston Python workshop for women and their friends works. So it's a 2-day workshop. On Friday, people get their computer set up to learn Python. On Saturday, they go through a programming lecture. We feed them lunch. they practice more Python in the interpreter, and then they dive into hands-on practical exercises in real projects that they'll hack on. So let's first talk about Friday. On Friday, people set up their computers with Python, a text editor, and we teach them the basics of a command line terminal. So one of the things that we found in terms of installing Python is that on Windows, say, if you install Python, Python doesn't get onto your system path. So if you open up a command prompt and you type Python, you get command not found. Once we figured that out, we adjusted our install instructions to add a bunch of information for how to modify the system path on Windows. Similarly, newcomers were having problems with text editors where they were having tabs and spaces in the same files. On all three platforms, we now give them clear instructions to clean that up and use all soft spaces from the beginning. We also have them go through the necessary steps to get the dependencies installed for the projects they'll work on Saturday. And also on Friday, they practice programming in Python, they go through the basics, and they become familiar with the interpreter. And that leaves them pretty in good shape to come back on Saturday. Now, I've talked a bit about what we have them do. I want to emphasize that all the information for what we tell students to do is available on the web that anyone can edit, shared under a permissive Creative Commons license. We'll show you at the end where you can all find that. So that's Friday. On Saturday, we dive in a bit more depth. So it begins with a programming lecture where students work through just the basics they need to get through the projects. That means that we've trimmed down a lot of content. We only have 2 hours for this. So we just give them the basics of types, dictionaries, lists, modules, functions, no classes, for example. And then we break for lunch. We've been really lucky to have sponsors for lunch for all 5 of our workshops so far. And finally, continuing Saturday after lunch, students practice programming a bit more hands-on in the Python interpreter, doing exercises so they're really ready for the projects. So that leaves 2 hours on Saturday for these hands-on projects. Of the 3 that we can offer, students pick 2. The color wall that you can see here is a great visual exercise set. It's a collection of LEDs, 8x8, that we simulate that students get to write new patterns for. Students also get to play with, they get to choose between also playing with the Twitter API, where we show them how to search and tweet from within the Python interpreter, and they can also learn about regular expressions and wordplay stuff used in the wordplay exercise. I want to emphasize that the projects are split into part lecture, part hands-on. So in the 1 hour that the students have for the projects, the first half is teaching them the basics, showing them the code of the project, and the second half is giving them concrete exercises to work through so that they have practice hacking on some real Python code. We conclude with a wrap-up on Saturday, and there we remind them of next steps for what they can do, how they can keep learning Python after the workshop. We tell them to fill out our exit survey so we know a lot more about how the workshop went and what people need. And also, we make sure to emphasize that there's an upcoming project night scheduled after every single one of the workshops so that students have a ramp into the main Python user group. So can you talk a bit about what we've done in terms of Boston Python as a whole?
Absolutely. So this has had a pretty transformative effect on the user group. Ned's going to kill me. Before, this is what the user group looked like. So Ned is really a hero to mankind for what he has done in Boston. For the past several years, he's been the sole organizer for what is already a pretty huge user group. It was about 700 members as of this time last year. And they were running monthly lecture-style events, which is great. But when you pick up new organizers, Asheesh and I became organizers as part of running these workshops, you get a lot more bandwidth to do more fun, awesome things. So we've over doubled in the past year to over 1,800 members. We still run those monthly lecture-style events, but we're also doing more lightning talks as a nice segue for getting sort of new speakers into the community. So lightning talks, these monthly unstructured hack nights, these project nights. We have our workshops every 2 months, and then a lot more social engagement. So going for beer after events and things like that is a thing that we do now. So a lot more opportunities for collaboration and for sharing. And then we're simply much bigger as well. And just to hammer it home, this is what our growth has looked like over the past year. So let's recall our goals. Number 1 was to get more women in the community with a target of 15% women at arbitrary user group events. And I'm happy to say that as of actually about the second workshop, we've been meeting this goal consistently. So for the past year, or the past 11 months, at any Boston Python user group event, we've had 15% women, which is pretty amazing. And these aren't small events either. These are events that attract 80 to 120 people. So some real numbers there. And then I think we've done a good job with 2 and 3 as well. But what's cool is that when you start meeting these goals, you can think about how to challenge yourself on these goals further. So this is what the goals can start looking like once we've met our original goals focusing on women in Boston. So let's move this out. Let's zoom out to thinking about how to make Boston great for everyone. Awesome, diverse people of all backgrounds. I mean, Boston is a great place for scientists, for entrepreneurs, for musicians. How can we start thinking about outreach towards these groups of people as well? And again, measurable long-term change. You don't know what you're doing unless you're willing to reflect on it and to actually measure it. So we've been able to do that. And then I want to share, sort of on a personal note, a couple of success stories that we've had that I think are very nice from Boston. There's a woman in the audience named Cynthia who we call our repeat offender in Boston because she actually attended 4 workshops. But she gets new stuff out of them every time, and it's been really great. She was an absolute beginner prior to these workshops. She went to the workshop, she became a project night staple, a user group lecture style event staple, really practicing, learning her material, and a couple of months ago, we keep in touch. A couple of months ago, she let us know that she got a consulting job, building a web app in Django for someone. This is like 8 months after having never programmed before, starting with the workshops. So that's pretty amazing. We have another woman named Rise who had been out of the workforce for a couple of years raising a kid. Her husband was a programmer, and she decided after going through 2 of our workshops that she wanted to get back into the workforce. What she wanted to do was get back in as a programmer. And again, Project Night regular, workshop alum, working on her craft, getting her resume set to start applying to jobs, and she's now a full-time software developer in Boston. Something that we see all the time, which is really amazing, is we have women who've been out of the workforce for 20 years. Women who were programmers 20 years ago, who took 20 years off raising kids, who attend these workshops and decide that they want to get back in. They've been gone for decades, and this is like the flashpoint for deciding to get started again. So these are just a couple of anecdotes, but on a personal note, I'm just really proud of what our volunteers have done and what our alums end up doing in this community. It's been really tremendously satisfying.
So Jessica explained how the workshop has affected the Boston Python user group. I want to highlight some of the stuff that we do behind the scenes that makes that success actually possible. First, I want to say thanks to the dozens of people who volunteered with us. I see at least Christine Spang in the audience. Any other volunteers who've volunteered in the workshop, raise your hand. You are awesome. Yeah, thank you all. We have had so many great volunteers, and it started out from me and Deb deciding that we wanted to run a workshop like this. We reached out to our friends in the free software communities that we knew, finding Christine and Jessica. And then from there, Jessica invited students from the MIT Computer Club, and from then on, we've had as many volunteers as we've needed as the workshops have grown. We are always very curious about what brings people to the workshops. Jessica and I have been talking a bit about the exit survey. One of the themes that comes up in the exit survey are this particular quote is from one particular person, but each of these is a theme we see a lot. People want to come to the workshops because it's a women-oriented event. We see this all over in the reasons people show up. And the fact that it's oriented at newcomers in particular means that people know that they won't be judged for being newcomers, they won't be judged for not knowing the answers to questions. It's a teaching event, and they know that. And the fact that it's free of cost means that people can show up for it not knowing if programming is going to be their career, not knowing if programming is going to be something they want to do at all, and they can have that experience. They can ramp up to all the success stories Jessica's talked about without spending any money. All these things have been really important to our attendees. And we really know that we're doing good work when we see feedback on the exit survey like this, that we're opening up a world of programming to people who weren't sure if programming was for them. Makes us feel really good. So we take all these results from the exit survey and we mull it over in the staff wrap-up that we do a few days after, maybe a couple weeks after each workshop. And through the reflection that we've got done during the staff wrap-up, we've made a few particular changes to the workshop. One is that we have students practice programming a lot more. You'll notice that in the beginning when I described the workshop, students practice coding on Friday, on Saturday morning during the lecture, and on Saturday afternoon, all before they dive into these hands-on projects. And we found that students were getting confused by some of the projects and really simplifying both the code that's used in the projects and teaching people what they need helped a lot with that. So with that said, I want to talk a bit about how we share the work that we do. One of the tenets of the Boston Python workshop is that all of the work we do is done in public. And it starts with our curriculum for the workshops being available for reuse, like I said, on the openhash.org wiki. And again, we'll have a link to that at the end. We also discuss these workshops along with other people who maintain and organize other diversity outreach events on the openhash.org events mailing list, which we'll tell you more about at the end. And we periodically write more public-facing updates on the web. Blog posts on our blog have been picked up by PyCon, Women 2.0, and RailsBridge. So with all that, Jessica, do you want to talk about how it's grown?
Yeah, so this is totally volunteer-driven, and it's free of cost and entirely volunteer-driven. So it's important that when we think about scaling this up to the 80-person, 90-person events that we run these days, we can do this in a sustainable way that's not going to burn anyone out. And the way to do that really is being really good about content refinement and reuse, getting it all online in a box that you can just unpack for the next workshop. So we try to be really good about that. And here are a couple of examples. One of the tools that we use is an online Python practice site called Coding Bats. You implement tiny functions to practice Python basics. And the reason you can use Coding Bat for Python at all to write custom questions is actually because we collaborated with the author of the site to make this possible. But we've written a ton of Coding Bat questions for our workshop attendees that we've sort of passed back upstream. And then also, totally unprompted by us, but apparently our cross-platform Python environment setup instructions are so robust and battle-tested that there's actually a Python bug open about incorporating some of what we've learned into the Python core documentation. So that's pretty cool. And we try to be good about dog fooding in the user group as well. So these unstructured hack nights that Asheesh talked about, we always have a beginner's corner where people who are absolute beginners can get the support they need to start learning and practicing Python. And we reuse a ton of the content from the workshop. So that's cool.
So we have talked a bit about how we've refined and shared the workshop. And I want to talk about the impact we've been able to have on communities outside of Boston. So last year I gave a talk at PyCon about how this had just begun. We had run one workshop literally a week before PyCon. Actually, I tried to carefully schedule the workshop so that it would take place before PyCon so I could talk about it here. And in the time since, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm and other outreach events from other groups. So first of all, Montreal Python in May last year ran a very similar Women and Their Friends outreach workshop. Yannick is in the audience from Montreal Python, any other Montreal Python people, thank you for running such a great event inside your user group. Lucas Black, Amanda Nyren, and Greg Lind all created this PyStar organization, which is another group that has workshop material online that you can use to run similar workshops and other different kinds of diversity outreach events. And PyLadies is a group that came up after we talked, Audrey and I, hi Audrey, after Audrey and I were talking about what we could do beyond this. Audrey decided to make PyLadies about creating new women-friendly Python user groups and channeling enthusiasm about women in Python into that organization. And that's been a really great boon. And congratulations again to Audrey on the award she received for all of that. And in fact, just following up on that, a group in Toronto started by Heather Payne was inspired by the work PyLadies did and is now teaching as a nonprofit all sorts of tech events for women, teaching them new skills. But I want to take a minute and reflect on the origin of our event, which is the San Francisco Ruby on Rails community's RailsBridge event. Woo, RailsBridge! So actually, our event, before we ran the first one, we sent Karen to a RailsBridge event. Well, Karen sent herself, but we had her write a lot about how it went so that we knew what you guys do. And one of the big things that RailsBridge does is these events are run inside the main Ruby on Rails user group in San Francisco. And from our experience and from seeing that, we've made that a big tenet of what we do, that our events are run inside of the main Python user group in our city so that we can have a lasting impact on the community, so that even when our volunteers get tired, the community can continue to support the people that we've brought in. So with that said, I want to give a special shout out to PyStar Philly. Dana's in the audience. I'll give you applause. PyStar Philly, they've run 3 workshops so far. They're organized as part of the Philly Python user group. And so they're beginning to see a huge impact on the Python user group in Philadelphia because of the way they're running those workshops. And all this is possible because we received recently a grant from the Python Software Foundation's Outreach and Education Committee. So we have a grant from them to run more of these workshops based in the user groups in more cities around the country, perhaps the world, though the travel won't fund it. And so we can talk with you more about how we can help you run workshops like that. And just quickly, we've had a big impact on PyCon as well. 7 of the 50 poster presentations are from people affiliated with the workshops in Boston or Philadelphia. That's 15% of the people who gave poster presentations are women who came in as a large part through the outreach that we started and has gone on in the rest of the community.
So I guess quickly, so what are our next steps? So it's 2012, we've run 5 of these workshops, what next? Well, the first thing we want to do is make sure we're sustaining things in Boston, so keeping up the participation that we've already seen. And then we like the idea of Boston being a sort of a staging ground for new experiments in diversity outreach. So you could imagine, like, what would an intermediate workshop look like? What would an intro to open source contribution event look like? Starting to think about these things in 2012, now that we've got a bunch of women into the pipeline. We have this PSF grant that Asheesh mentioned. And then, yeah, so 2012, we've got people into the pipeline. How can we get them stepping into teaching and leadership positions? So here's an expanded pipeline from before. You get in through the Boston Python workshop, you become a regular at project nights, a user group regular, and then we hook you. We get you giving a lightning talk, get you helping at the workshop, maybe giving a full-length lecture-style events, and then before you know it, you have people presenting at PyCon, they're PSF members. You know, we really go from local impact to global community impact pretty quickly, and we're seeing that even at this PyCon. So this is pretty amazing. This is what I want to see for PyCon 2013. I hope to have lots more to report back next year.
So for you, what's your next step? We want all of you to go back to your cities and run outreach workshops where you are. Get in touch with us and ask for help, or find us during the sprints, email or in person. The easiest and the best thing to do perhaps at first is to run an open project night. So these project nights are pretty easy to set up. They're a hack night by any other name. You don't have to have much structure for them. What you need is to make sure that you have a corner for beginners, and that you emphasize that both during the event and in the advertising for the event, so people know that it's going to be a judgment-free place. You're going to have to do some work to make sure the tone is set that way in person. But once you've done that, people will bring their own stuff to work on. Existing members of the user group will volunteer and help newcomers, and you'll be building this pipeline just like that. And if you want to, run an intro event. So you don't have to make these about diversity if you don't want to. Pick the goal that you want for your user group. Perhaps it's just size, perhaps it's to bring more scientists in. Whatever you want, pick your goal, commit to it, and then you'll find that people in your user group will help you. Once you, this is what I found at least. Anyway, we found so many great volunteers, and you all can do it too. Once you've done it, once you've committed to it, you'll be able to pick up from our material to run your own workshop, and you'll be able to also ask us for help when you need it.
And just so, when people think about running an intro event focusing on women in their cities, a common initial reaction is, but there are no women. Like, who would even run this event with me? I'm just a dude. And the answer is, well, A, have you actually asked for help in your community? Like, have you actually sent mail to the mailing list saying this is what you want to do and seeing who's popped out of the woodworks? Because I think you'd be surprised. And then B, I bet there are a lot of local resources that you haven't considered. And I mean, this is for women, but think about this abstractly for scientists, for musicians, for entrepreneurs as well. I mean, have you talked to the local CS groups, like the Women in CS group at local universities, the Society of Women Engineers groups? There are 2 international mailing lists, Sisters and Dev Chicks, that are devoted to issues of women in tech, who would love to get you in touch with local volunteers in your area. So you have a lot of resources if you're willing to put in the time and you're willing to ask for help. And that is really the bottom line. If you ask for help, people will be thrilled to help you. And then moreover, if you ask for help, companies will be thrilled to help you. A lot of companies have budgets expressly for this kind of community outreach. So from there, like Asheesh said, pick a goal and just do it, and iterate on it, be honest, reflect on it, and do it again. I think you're going to be really surprised with and pleased by the results that you see in your city. Here are a couple of resources. These slides will be online if you want to check out our material. In particular, please check out one of our example wikis for like a particular instance of the workshop to see what kind of material we have online. And then I leave you with our thesis. Diversity outreach makes your user group better, and it makes it better for everyone. And if you want to grow, this is a great way to help you grow. So please, as you leave PyCon 2012, go back to your cities, think about the kind of diversity outreach that would help make your user group better and help it grow, and just go do it. And please report back to us for PyCon 2013. We want to know all about the successes that you've had. We can help you, the PSF will help you, so I encourage you all to just go do it and see what happens. And that is it. So thank you. All right, so we maybe have infinite time for questions because we're last.
Sorry. Hi, I think you guys are doing fabulous work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question is, how do you advertise the workshops? What does it say? What does it look like for these kinds of things?
Do you want to just load up one of the meetup pages?
Yeah, do that while I talk about it. I mean, so there are a couple of things here. One is to make the tone very clear. We're about being inclusive and about growing communities and not about being exclusive. So if you're just a little bit careful about your language there, I think you'll find that everyone is thrilled to support you in this. Men, women, everyone. And then, yeah, so he's going to pull up an example event description just so you know what it looks like. But I mean, the tone is the big thing here. And it's all, part of running through a user group means you can bootstrap through that user group. So advertise the event with the user group. You'll get a ton of attendees right off the bat. They'll use their networks to grab more people. And at least in big cities like Boston, we were able to run the first several workshops strictly through user group membership. But they're a good place to start reaching out. And then those resources that I mentioned for getting people to help run workshops are a great place to get people to attend workshops as well.
But did you call it Women and Friends?
Oh, I see. We called it the Boston Python Workshop, and it was,
For women and their friends.
Okay. Depending on where you look at the advertising, it's the Boston Python Workshop for women and their friends.
How do I use your virtual desktops?
Oh my gosh. Let's not.
Sorry.
Hold this.
Okay. I have a Firefox window over here on the virtual desktops over there. Yeah, so we'll take the next question. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to point out that the woman on the stage is fixing the computer, which is my life, right?
Minimize the window.
That's my day-to-day. Audrey fixes my stuff. But great talk. One thing I want to point out before I ask my question, another thing is Jessica is up for to be a PSF director.
Is that right? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the question I have is you talked about all of your successes, and you've had a lot of them. What were some challenges? What were some obstacles that were thrown in your way, and what did you do to overcome them?
I can begin by talking about the beginning, where I wasn't sure if Ned would let me take over his Python user group to run this event. So my strategy was, inclusion in the main user group was a real goal of mine. And so what I did was I just gave a talk about how great it would be, and then he invited me to run it inside the user group. And I was like, excellent, that's exactly what I wanted him to say after that presentation. But after that...
But initially integrating with the user group, there's some coordination aspects to that, there's some tone setting, expectation setting aspects to that require some care. We're very fortunate that Ned has been so supportive from the very beginning in Boston. But getting started is definitely the hardest part, and then from there, you just keep going.
Just one more, I guess. We've iterated on, I mentioned briefly, we iterated on the projects. Making sure those are of really high quality is something that we put in a lot of effort into, and it's not something we got right initially. So all the stuff, spaces versus tabs, Python not on the path, and on and on.
But the reason we know this is because we're very honest about it. We run these exit surveys, we run these staff wrap-ups. Like, you don't know unless you actually ask these questions of yourselves and your alums, so do that.
So one of the major goals of the PSF Sprints Committee was to build something like a sprint in a box package. So if your group wants to run a sprint, here are all the resources you need to find a place, to how do you actually run a sprint, all that stuff like that. What can we do to sort of take all the work you guys have done and package this into like a single outreach workshop in a box package.
We'll just do that next couple weeks, right?
Done.
Okay.
We're on it with
Awesome.
you. Get in touch. We'll make it happen. Although, a little more subtly, every community is different, so definitely there's care for each community that has to be taken. But yes, let's do it. Workshop in a box.
Awesome.
One of the big problems that someone came up to me today with getting something like this kicked off is that their user group right now is taking place in a coffee shop or restaurant or a bar, and it just sets completely the wrong tone, and it's not workable. Do you have any advice for trying to get out of that rut?
Yeah, so we ran the first 2 workshops at Space donated by local businesses in Boston. Now, Boston's pretty spoiled, admittedly, but 2 local businesses, and then we've been running at MIT since then. So check out, see if local colleges and universities, we've had people run stuff in libraries. When's the last time you went to your local library? Here's a great opportunity to do that. But there are community spaces that are in general happy to help, and then there are businesses that are often happy to help as well. So if you ask for help, you'll usually get it.
Do you find you need to do anything in particular to keep people social enough during the project nights to keep them asking each other for help and cooperating, or is that happening naturally?
It happens pretty naturally, is what she whispered to me as a question. But also, because we at the beginning, Jessica really at the beginning says, there's a beginner's corner, it's over here. If you're a newbie or you want to help newbies, go there. It kind of doesn't matter if the rest isn't as social, so long as that is.
Although they are social.
Yes.
It's tone setting. So if you as organizers set the tone that we're going to be social and collaborative and positive, it'll just happen.
So you awkwardly stand up at the beginning and say, here's how it's going to be. And then it is that way.
That's true.
You talked about scaling this up a bit, but I'm wondering if you have any advice for scaling it down, maybe for people that are in smaller cities. I would think that we'd want to look for women that would be interested, but maybe are scared of a judgy environment, and aren't usually willing to get involved. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, you can definitely run a workshop at any size. And our first workshop was like 20 people.
I guess it's just a matter of where would we find these women that might be interested, but are just scared or haven't thought of it?
Yeah, so I talked briefly, there was a slide where I talked briefly about a couple of resources. If you're willing to take the time to ask, I think there are a lot of local resources as well as sort of mailing lists that can help you bootstrap. And then again, if you run it with the user group, take advantage of that existing user base.
Yeah, just to add a couple more things. The initial pool of people, so the second workshop filled up within 7 hours because the first one filled up in 24, 48, something like that. I think it was 48. And the first workshop filled up reasonably quickly because people in the user group remembered, oh yeah, I have this friend of mine who's been telling me she wants to learn Python.
Gotcha.
And that's a huge source of outreach. And the other is people emailed the information about the workshop to their company's mailing lists.
That's true.
And then people selected themselves.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions, so I apologize in advance for my verbosity. So the first question relates to actually your feedback that you got. You mentioned, one of the comments was that a woman was really glad to find a place where she wasn't afraid. So I'm just wondering, did you notice any trends in the kind of feedback you're getting as to why women before this hadn't really stepped into the programming world? Because I'd love to run a regression analysis on, the data you're getting. But, and I'm wondering if you think it's mostly socialization, whether cultural or social, that accounts for those trends, or if there's any malicious intent on, maybe the hacker culture may be a little misogynist. I don't know.
There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know where to.
Very quickly, I would just say that all of the feedback we've gotten seems to be constantly. Nothing seems to talk about direct misogyny or direct threats in any of the feedback we receive about why people chose to go.
Yeah.
So in that case, the regression is flat.
The Python community is in general super supportive. A lot of people need a tiny little extra push, and we are that tiny little extra push. And they just haven't seen that little push before.
So my second question, I'm just wondering if anything you learned from these user groups could be mapped onto public education. And I feel like a lot of problems starts earlier, so I don't know.
Yeah, so one of the funny things about these workshops is it kind of seems like slowly but surely, as we do better, it feels like public education, we're filling gaps that public education left 15 years, 30 years later. But I don't know how this can address that, which is a real tragedy.
Maybe you don't have to solve all the world's problems.
This
is just more of a comment than anything. I started the Python KC user group about 7 months ago, and we looked to you guys as an example, and how to run our user group. And it just
did it work?
We've got 100 members in 6 months,
Awesome.
and especially the project nights. And especially the project nights, we found that teaching anybody about Python, women, newbies, PHP developers, anybody else, has been the best way to pull new people in, because then they go back out and talk about it. Python's, people get stuck on it, and exposing them to that has been a great help. So you guys are awesome.
So a tremendous vote for project nights. Everyone, if your user group doesn't run a project night, consider it. Hi, Glyph.
Hi, Glyph.
Hi, Jessica. Hi, Asheesh. So I obviously know these folks, and I want to make 2 comments. One was just I wanted to thank Ned because that Superman slide didn't even do it justice. Ned ran a really amazing user group for a long time, and I would go occasionally, and it was pretty cool every time I went. But the main comment that I wanted to make was that this has all been pretty technical about how do we do this and how can we get it started. And just in case there are any skeptics in the audience or watching this online later, I cannot overstate the positive impact that this has had on our user group. Like, I'm going to be leaving the city of Boston soon, and this is one of the most disappointing things, is leaving this user group. It is like going to PyCon every 2 weeks. The newcomers to the group are incredibly full of enthusiasm and new ideas and energy and inquisitiveness and openness that has infected the whole group. It is amazing, and they've already gotten a couple of rounds of applause for what they've done, but they deserve more. You could be clapping until you leave, and it wouldn't be enough. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Asheesh. Everybody in Boston and everybody around the world trying to promote Python really appreciates it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Glyph. Wow.
Yes, I'm one of the organizers from Houston. I've got a question. Is how far in advance do you advertise the project nights, and I guess a different time frame, though, the workshops?
Yeah, so we know that we run project nights every month, so it's like 2 weeks prior to the event. We publish the event on meetup.com. And for workshops, we happen to do it like 2.5 weeks in advance, but we have a good sense of how quickly they're going to fill up and how flaky people get if you announce things too far in advance. So we've sort of tuned it based on those things. And free events, you have to be careful about that, because sometimes free implies low quality, and people don't realize the extremely high quality of these workshops. So being careful about convincing them of that and holding them to their RSVPs has been important.
And we do send them reminders a few days before,
absolutely.
saying, if you can't come, RSVP and let the waitlisters in.
Too tall. Okay. Great work, obviously. I'm just curious, have you seen how many other groups outside the Python community doing this? And are they being as impactful as we are? And if not, is it something technical or social or what? Like, I'm sure Python's teachability has really contributed to this, but I'm just wondering, like, does the Ruby community have a similar thing going? Perl or Java, God forbid, or whatever? I mean, just, is this somehow become a very Python-specific thing, or is this actually outreach beyond us? Because obviously there's the Ruby stuff up in San Francisco, but is it only in SF, or how big is it, or just?
So Railsbridge began some 3-4 years ago. I can see some enthusiastic faces that. Railsbridge actually is in multiple cities all over the country.
That's good.
I think that Railsbridge and the Python workshops are by far the most active of these outreach efforts. I once ran last summer an event at a Scala hackathon, something kind of like this, but there's no sustained effort in that community like that. And I haven't heard of similar things from other programming languages, but if you're watching afterwards, you should email us.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Michael. I've been trying to, I'm from LA, and I've been working kind of with the local Python group and PyLadies, Audrey and Danny right there. And we've been trying to get things going. I do have one question, though. You talked about numbers a lot. Do you have any sense of retention, both in beginner, intermediate, and advanced? I mean, how many people come back? I mean, what do they really learn? Like, what are the drop-off points? I mean, anything that's, I guess, a pretty shiny graph that can tell us anything.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so there are a couple of answers to this. One is that our goal with the workshop is not to have every single person who goes to a workshop become a user group regular. If if all that they take out of this is a positive computing experience, but programming isn't for them right now, that is totally fine with us. And we get a lot of that by focusing on the absolute beginners. And we mostly look at things in the aggregate. Like we see beginners at every event. We see workshop alums at every event. We have the data, but haven't really tried to extract like exactly the percentages of specific people attending every event. But we're pretty happy with the aggregate results, and that's sort of what our focus has been right now. Is that a fair answer?
I'll also recklessly speculate. So, so just to give you some broad numbers with some context about the way the retention works, we mentioned that more than 200 people have come through the workshop. I don't know if that double counts, Cynthia. Quadruple counts. So if you take that as the total number, and maybe you see our final number of 15% women showing up repeatedly to Python user group events, the Python user group is a rotating crew of a bunch of people who show up on and off. Maybe 3 times that many are the pool of people who are creating that 15%. So you might guess it's about 20 to 25% from these speculative numbers.
Thank you.
No, thanks. If you have anything else to add.
I think we're way over time.
But
so
I'm happy to stay.
Well, come talk to us. I mean, we'll both be at the sprints. Please send us an email. Our slide's gone, but send us an email. Ask us questions. The PSF can help. OpenHatch can help. The Boston Python Workshop can help you do stuff like this in your city. So please think about it.
And come up here.